God takes over, and I'm blown away, and I realize that God can and will use people if they're willing to be, willing to let Him.
Worship in itself, as we said, it comes from the heart. While there's a wrong way, there's not one right way to do it.
But I definitely believe when I step aside and don't rely too much on my own ability, that just amazing things happen.
It's another week of Inside the Bible, a weekly podcast with spiritual insights on biblical truth. Welcome, my name's Andrew Inman, and we're back to the story of Joseph. This episode's brought to you by the grace of God, the power that calls humanity out of darkness into the everlasting life found in Jesus Christ. Took a break last week from the story of Joseph. Now we're back to it. Genesis chapter 42. Only this time, it's a totally different setting. So far, we focused mostly on the one who's betrayed. And we focused a lot on the person who's been betrayed and tried to relate it to a person who's faced betrayal by a loved one or people that they never saw to be the type to betray them in unfair situations. Now, we're going to take a look at the betrayer. Because Joseph is not the only person in this story. This story is essentially about salvation brought to the world through Joseph, a picture of Christ. But it's also about reuniting. Because one day, despite Christ being rejected by his own, eventually a day's coming where his own will recognize him. After the second coming, God desires for Israel to be reunited and to be on the right track, for unity to take place once again. And unity is about to take place with Joseph. And so we take a break from everything we've seen in Joseph. We've seen the climax after every single thing he's been through. Betrayed by his brothers, betrayed by Potiphar's wife, betrayed by a man in prison, and now God has elevated him to a place where he can do service underneath the Pharaoh, to be a hope for the rest of the world. But now that he's reached his climactic point, God will do a work that we ultimately don't see coming. God's about to do a work that Joseph is completely oblivious to. His brothers are oblivious to. God's going to bring them to a place where they are in the same position. And we'll begin to see the work that God's about to do in both him and his brothers, in Joseph and his brothers, to reunite his family back as one again, to settle the conflict. So now we focus on the ones who have betrayed, the ones who are ultimately guilty, worthy of judgment. How will Joseph respond when they come face to face with him? We know that Joseph was sold into slavery. Now that's low. I don't think it gets any lower than that unless you get on the topic of murder, which they were about to do. Joseph came to his brothers, made a prediction, had a dream that they would one day bow down to him. They were binding sheaves in a field, and all of a sudden their sheaves bowed down to his. In other words, their work bowed down to his work. As if it was to say, all the work you've done is going to be less significant than the work I'm going to do. It'll be less acknowledgeable. It won't measure up. You could see why they would get offended by that, why they would get a little bit jealous and annoyed by him. And then he went so far as to have the second dream. You were all the stars, you were all the planets up in space, and you were all bowing down to me. And his brothers found it to be so ridiculous because he's basically saying that the universe will bow down to him. And even his father thought it was kind of crazy, and his father favored him the most. Yet the Bible says that even Jacob kept it in the back of his mind, or Israel kept it in the back of his mind, because, hey, he recognized that his son had great leadership skills. And boy, was he right to recognize it. Because as we move on in the story, we find that everywhere he goes, those leadership skills, those abilities are recognized by other people. He's elevated in the house of Potiphar, elevated in the prison, and now, because of his ability to interpret the dreams, not just to his brothers, not just to the two men in prison, but also to Pharaoh, regarding the famine in the land and regarding the 7 plentiful years. Now he's been given a position above anybody else. Pharaoh says, I'm going to make you greater than anyone else in Egypt. I'm going to elevate you above all of them and make you responsible for collecting all the plentiful growth that is going to happen in these 7 years before the famine. And as a result, now Joseph has forgotten all the turmoil he's been through because he's discovered God's purpose for him. But now we take a shift. We shift from the one who's been betrayed, and we're going to focus on the betrayers. Their unification. How do they reunite with him? Well, they have to come to a point of crossing paths with Joseph again. God desires for them to be back together again. But they have to cross paths, and God has to do an amazing work, which he's about to do, and you're about to see that God is about to make something happen that so many of us would not want to happen if we've been through what Joseph has been through. Unification, restoration, forgiveness, fixing the problem that happened. So the famine's going on, and Joseph's family are in the land of Canaan with no more food. No more food to eat. And so the father asks them in verse 1 of chapter 42. Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look upon one another? In other words, what are you doing sitting around? Why don't you get over there? And he said, behold, I've heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get up and go down there and buy for us from there, that we may live and not die. Now, why are the brothers sort of sitting around, knowing that they're out of food and that they need to get out of there? Why do they need to be scurried out the door by their father? Chances are they know that Egypt was the place that they sold Joseph originally. And perhaps out of fear of running into him, they don't want to face that conviction. They don't want to wind up down there in Egypt and see their brother perhaps laboring, because they sold him to be a slave. And as far as they understand it, he still is a slave, because people don't get out of slavery that easily. And so they don't want to wind up running into him and have to face the conviction. It's funny, there would be no consequences if he's just a slave. And yet they're afraid of the conviction, as so many people are. And so it says here in verse 3, and Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob did not send with his brothers. For he said, lest perhaps mischief come upon him. In other words, I trusted you with Joseph so many years ago. You've proven you can't be trusted. And so I'm not going to lose my other youngest son because of your irresponsibility. Verse 5, and the sons of Israel, that is to say Jacob, came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came down and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brothers, and he knew them, but he made himself strange to them, that is to say, unrecognizable, and spake roughly to them. And he said unto them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph knew his brothers, but they did not know him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them. At this point, Joseph looks back and he recognizes, ironically, despite the fact that in the last chapter, he named his son Manasseh, meaning that God has caused me to forget the struggle that I faced. And yet he doesn't forget the vision, the purpose. We can forget the struggle. We reach the climactic point of our ministry, and yet, even though the struggle doesn't bother us, we look back and realize, hey, this was the vision. This is what it took to get here. Never knew it would be so hard, but you never forget the vision. And so Joseph here doesn't forget the vision. He remembers the dreams of his brothers bowing down to him. And now he's made himself strange. And he said to them, you are spies. You're spies and you've come to see the nakedness of the land. That's why you've come here. Verse 10, and they said to him, no, Lord, but to buy food. That's why your servants have come. We are all one man's sons. We are true men. Your servants are no spies. And he said to them, no, but to see the nakedness of the land, that's why you've come. And they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of a man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not. And Joseph said to them, that is it as I spoke to you. You are spies. Interesting. Joseph knows they're not spies. Joseph knows that they're not anyone but his brothers who betrayed him. Why is he speaking roughly to them? Why is he speaking in such a way? There's a lot of theories behind this. And number one, which I don't even think is just theory, it can be considered fact, is that he's testing his brothers. He desires to be reunited with them after years of separation, and yet, oddly enough, he needs to test their sincerity. Knowing full well that they're his brothers, he still needs to see that the motives of their heart are repentant. And so here's the test. Verse 15, here's how you will be proved that you are not spies. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall go forth from here, except your youngest brother come back with you. In other words, you won't leave here unless one of you goes and brings back the brother. It's a test. Perhaps he wants the youngest brother to come back because he first desires to see his youngest brother again and say, hey, Benjamin, I haven't seen you in a while. Hey, man, guess what? Guess what happened? Pharaoh elevated me to this position. What have you been up to all these years? But he especially wants to see the sincerity of his brothers, see if they are repentant. So he says in verse 16, send one of you and let him fetch your brother, and you shall be kept in prison. The rest of you will be kept in prison, that your words may be tested, whether you are telling the truth. Or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And he put them all together into the ward for 3 days. Interesting that he puts them in for exactly 3. It's kind of a contrasting picture of the judgment that Christ took for us. Going 3 days into the deep, when Israel and the rest of the world deserved more than 3 days judgment. Christ went for 3 days into Hades and came and set the captives free. And so, this contrasting picture, he puts his brothers into prison for 3 days. And he said to them on the 3rd day, do this, do as I told you, and you will live, for I fear God. It's interesting. He fears the Lord above all else. He's in a position of authority. And so many of us at times can get into a position of leadership, authority in some way. Maybe that you're a manager at your job, you're a leader of your church, you're a coordinator of an event, and yet in every case, you are under the governing of God. God is above you. How important it is to recognize that, knowing that you have the ultimate judgment for everything that is carried out, and yet every judgment you make needs to be done in accordance with godliness. Because ultimately, God is the one who will judge us in the end. So often we commit vengeance for injustice on other individuals. We're quick to execute judgment and yet not do it with the fear of the Lord, knowing that the only righteous judgment is God's. And so before we execute judgment, no matter what authority we have, ultimately, in the end, we ought to be coming before him and asking, Lord, what is the right decision to make? Joseph, even in this position, fears the Lord, even though his brothers may deserve the worst of judgment for what they did to him. Verse 19, if you are true men, let one of your brothers be bound to the house of your prison. Go you and carry corn for the famine for your houses, but bring your youngest brother to me. So shall your words be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. So after that third day, at first he was going to say, I'm going to put you all in prison and only send one for Benjamin. But after considering, hey, if they legitimately have a household of people who are hungry, I'll let all but one go. Bring corn back to their house. And all of a sudden, just in case they are true men, they'll be able to survive. And they took advantage of this opportunity, were set free. And they said one to another, we are guilty concerning our brother, that is to say Joseph, and that we saw the anguish of his soul when he asked of us, and we would not hear him, when he begged us not to kill him or sell him into slavery, and we would not hear him. Therefore is this distress come on us. They're recognizing this whole turmoil, this circumstance they're in, is only because of what they did to Joseph. And yet in verse 23 or verse 22, Reuben answers them saying, did I not say to you not to sin against a child? But you would not hear. Therefore, behold, his blood is required. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them in an interpreter. And he turned himself about from them and wept, and returned them again, and communed with them, and took with them Simeon, and bound him before their eyes. So Joseph, fully aware of their conversation, yet making himself strange, speaking through an interpreter, speaking in Egyptian. They're completely ignorant to the fact that he understands them as they begin to wallop in their regret. He can see their level of regret, but it's not enough to know if they're repentant. You see, a man can have regret for the wrong reasons. He can regret the wrong that he's done, makes his confession, but not even realize that God is standing right there in his presence. Ironically, you can imagine God's response much like Joseph. We neglect our relationship with the Lord, and it saddens him. Just as Joseph went away crying, God does not take joy when we sin, especially when we're willing to acknowledge our wrongs to ourselves, but not taking the time to confess them to him. He's right there in the room listening to you. Oh, I've made this big mistake. I've made this big flaw. Wish I didn't do this. Wish I didn't go down this road. Yet not taking time to confess to him, knowing that ultimately it was against him. As David said, against you, Lord, and only you have I sinned. If we would recognize that our ultimate confession belongs to God, but like Joseph standing before his brothers, unrecognized, we don't even recognize that God is there, ready to hear our confession. And so our sincerity is not evident enough. Verse 25, then Joseph commanded his servants to fill their sacks with corn, and to restore every man's money into his sack, and to give them provision for the way. And so they did so unto them. Hey, we're sending you away with corn for your family, but without telling you, we're going to put your money back in your sack. Restore your money to you. And they saddled their donkeys with the corn and departed from there. And one of them opened his sack to give his donkey provender in the inn. He espied his money, or in other words, he noticed his money there, for behold, it was in the sack's mouth. And he said to his brothers, My money is restored, and look, it is even in my sack. And their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying one to another, What is this that God has done to us? There you go. The typical, God, what have you done to me? Did an accident ever occur that you knew would cost you greatly? And instead of just staying calm, you panic, saying, God, what have you done? It's a mistake that may cost you, but peacefully coming to the person it affects and explaining your perspective is still better than covering it up. What is the brother's response to this whole situation? They panic, they blame God, they go home, as we're about to see here. They don't go back to Egypt, say, hey, we found this in our sack, we don't know how we made it in there. No, but for fear of the judgment that's about to come on to them, they go home and consult from their father instead. We sometimes commit similar flaws, and as a result, don't go to the people who have unfortunately been mistakenly wronged. Always unfortunate. And they came to Jacob their father into the land of Canaan and told him all that came unto them. Now the next few verses going on from 29 all the way down to 34 is basically them just explaining everything we've read, so we'll skip over it. Verse 35, And it came to pass after they had explained their situation to God that they emptied their sacks, and behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when both they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, You have deprived me of my children. Joseph's not here anymore. Simon is not here. And you will take Benjamin away. All these things are against me. And Reuben spoke to his father, saying, Slay my 2 sons, if I bring your son not back to you. Deliver him into my hands, and I will bring him to you again. Kind of a stupid statement, if you ask me. Your father's afraid that he's going to lose a 3rd son. He's already lost 2. His favorite son, and one of his average favorite sons. And for some reason, his son, Reuben, thinks it'll fix things if, hey, I'll slay my 2 sons if I can't bring both your sons back to you. Idiot. I mean, I get the thought process. Hey, Dad, you're going to go through sorrow if you lose your sons. Well, then put me through sorrow. Let my 2 sons die. But not considering the love that his father has, even for family. Think about it. If you lost a couple of kids and somebody said to you, hey, kill your grandchild, how does that fix the issue? Kind of a stupid statement. So Reuben spoke this to his father, and he promises, I'll bring your son Benjamin back to you. And he said, My son shall not go with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If mischief come upon him by the way in which you go, then shall you bring down the gray hairs of my head with sorrow to the grave. We know that stress can ultimately cause hair to change color. People who constantly live under stress just have gray hairs. Kind of weird how that formulates. Stress just causes your hair to turn gray. But he says, look, if you take my sons away from me, you take Benjamin away, you let my other son stay in that prison, you've already caused me to lose one, and one of them is in prison over there. You take my other favorite youngest son, you'll destroy everything. You'll give me no joy to live with. Quite the situation that Jacob's sons have gotten themselves into from one act of betrayal. And they recognize that this may be God's judgment for them not treating Joseph with the respect that they needed to. But little do they know that this is God working things out for the better so that unification can come between them again. And so I don't know if you have division in your life. I don't know if you have separation from people that you know. But as we go on in the coming weeks with this study in the life of Joseph, we're going to discover God's hand working. Little do they know how God's hand is working in all of this to reunite the people who were separated by betrayal, separated by sin and selfishness, and how God will bring it all together for good. May God bless you and keep you in the way you go this week. God bless.